Hey guys, how you doing? I'm going to go ahead and walk you through Chapter 1's PowerPoint, and I just use the PowerPoints to organize the chapter for you, highlight different concepts that you're going to need to know, especially when we get to the baby book. When you have your baby in the class and you apply what you're learning to your own child that's going to grow from birth to age 18. So I hope that you find the PowerPoints helpful and useful. Again, I just highlight the terms and concepts and let you know what's really important to know. So let's pop over here to Chapter 1, just the introduction, which goes over all the terms and definitions that you need to know. So human development is just understanding how and why all different kinds of people everywhere of every age change over time. Why are we the way we are? I really want you to know the scientific method because so often you read things in magazines or you'll see something on the internet, and I want you to be able to examine it using the scientific method, which just begins with a question. What's your burning question? What are you curious about? What do you wonder about with child development? Then we develop that burning question into a hypothesis where you kind of state your prediction. I believe that spanking leads to children that have low self-esteem. What is your prediction and how can we test that? Then you move into the testing part. And testing can be done in all different kinds of ways, whether it's an experiment or interviews or surveys or naturalistic observations, and we're going to cover that in just a second. After you test your hypothesis, you're going to draw your conclusions. Was your hypothesis correct or not? And then lastly, you have to report your results. Once you transfer to the university, you'll find that a lot of those professors have to do research and they have to publish their research. So they don't often spend a lot of time teaching, but they do spend a majority of their time doing research. So sharing your data, what did you find out, and publishing that in a professional journal. One of the big themes in child development is nature versus nurture. Nature is what's born within us, our genetics, and nurture is our environment. What were the things in your environment that influenced you? And I hope that you see, after you read the chapter and you kind of think about this, that it's really not one or the other. It's both, nature and nurture. For those of you that saw me at the orientation, you guys saw I'm really tall. I'm 6 feet tall. My dad's 6'6". So part of that is genetics. I get a lot of my height from my dad, but also the environment. If I hadn't gotten good nutrition or if I hadn't have gotten good health care when I was younger, then I wouldn't have reached my full potential. So oftentimes it's nature and nurture, not one or the other. A couple definitions I want you to know. Critical period is on page 16 in your book, and that's a time frame where something must occur in development versus a sensitive period where development is just most likely to occur. Language is the best example of a sensitive period. We know from birth to 3 is the really sensitive time for language development. If a child isn't read to and sang to and talked to and exposed to language from birth to age 3, they're going to have a really difficult time learning it later. But also on page 20, it talks about plasticity, and our brains are fairly plastic. They're malleable. We can change and we can learn things later in life. It becomes a lot harder. I'm sure a lot of you have learned a second language as an adult. It's possible to do, but it's just a lot harder. So that illustrates the plasticity of the brain, that it is malleable and it can change. So we're going to look at all different kinds of people, ethnic groups, different racial groups, socioeconomic status. Unfortunately, money really impacts the way a child is raised and what kinds of experiences they have. But I hope over the course of this semester you'll find that everything in child development is a balance, right? It's not one or the other. It's usually a balance of all the things that we're going to look at. Another theme when we talk about development is continuity versus discontinuity. Is learning gradual and consistent, or does it happen in big leaps and bounds? Again, it's probably a little bit of both. One researcher that I really want you to know, and we are going to talk about Bronfenbrenner chapter after chapter, especially when we get to our case studies, you're going to think about all the different systems and how those systems affect a child. So you see you got the child in the center here. The microsystem is everything that's small, that's directly related to the child. So who's in the family, health services, church, neighborhood, friends, and school are all part of the things that directly impact the child almost on a day-to-day basis. Mesosystem means interactions between two or more microsystems. So the best example of this is, does your family go to your school events? So how does family and school interact with back to school nights and open houses and things like that? Do your friends live in the same neighborhood as you? Do you have access to friends in your neighborhood? So that's mesosystem. Exosystem means outside. So things that may not have a daily impact on the child, but they still impact our development. So friends of the family, mass media, screen time. We're going to talk a lot about screen time and how it impacts a child. Do you have access to services, community services? And then lastly is macro system. You guys probably heard my cat meowing in the background right then. Macro means big. So macro is how does culture impact you? How does religion impact you? So we're going to look at Bronfenbrenner so much this semester, and you're going to apply those different systems to the child that you raise in our class. So using the scientific method, what kind of research do researchers do? Researchers can do a naturalistic observation, which you guys are going to do this semester with your assignments. You just go out and observe children and families in their natural environment, whether it's home or a school or a park. It means strictly being an objective observer. Other times, researchers might set up an experiment, and in an experiment, you have an independent and a dependent variable. And I used to get these confused all the time when I was in school. So a teacher taught me a good way to tell them apart is to set it up as an if-then statement. So if I eat ice cream, then I get a headache. So the if, is the independent statement, stands alone. The dependent variable is depending upon the independent variable. So getting a headache depends upon eating the ice cream. So just a helpful little hint to how to remember independent versus dependent variables. Sometimes researchers will survey. They'll send out questionnaires to parents or to teachers to get some feedback to prove or refute their hypothesis. Sometimes surveys, you may not get honest information, right? Asking about discipline. Parents may not be honest if they spank their children or use any harsh, punitive forms of discipline. They're not going to admit that on a survey. So sometimes you don't get honest responses. Couple more definitions you need to know, especially when you're evaluating advice that people give you about parenting. Cross-sectional versus longitudinal research. Cross-section just means they took a random sample of preschoolers and compared them to a random sample of, say, teenagers. Longitudinal research is the same group of people, so you're not going to have any other outlying factors that might impact your research. Correlation versus causation. Oftentimes two things are just correlated, which means they're just related somehow. We don't know why. We don't know if one thing causes the other. They're just related. Causation means that one thing causes another. There's kind of a fun little quiz on page 29 that you can take for that. And lastly is looking at ethical dilemmas. A lot of the research in child development, we have to consider ethics. For example, language development. You're not going to lock a child in a closet for 3 years to see what happens to their language development. It's just not ethical. So there have been cases of abuse where they can go back and survey and do some naturalistic observations if a child was deprived of language development in their early years. But as researchers, we just have to be very careful about ethical dilemmas with research. And that is the end of chapter 1. So like I said, the PowerPoints just kind of organize the information, let you know what to expect. I try to give you some examples. I'll throw in some videos every now and then to kind of illustrate the concepts that you need to know. But I hope that helped. And if you have any questions, let me know.